So just to do a quick recap for those of you who have joined, again, we'll welcome you to this session. This session is going to be on why mobile connectivity should be at the heart of digital inclusion. It follows actually a report that Mobile UK itself is launching today. We'll go into that later. But firstly, if I could introduce myself, I am Gareth Elliott. I'm Director of Policy and Communications at Mobile UK, with a trade body for the 4 main mobile operators. But I am joined here today by 2 other digital leaders. We have Beena Puri from the Greater Manchester Combined Authority, and she is the Digital Innovation and Partnerships Lead. And secondly, we have Whelan, who is the Advocacy Manager at the Good Things Foundation. So if we could get a quick wave from you both. Excellent.
Hello.
Hi.
Brilliant. Well, as I say, what we got into question today is about digital inclusion and mobile connectivity. But before we really get into that, I really want to sort of just explore what is digital inclusion, because we live in a world now where banks are disappearing from the high street. You're expected to engage with your bank purely through your mobile or your laptop. Grocery shopping can now be delivered direct to your door, again via an app. Prices often cheaper online as well, so you have access to a much larger market. And even your GP appointments these days are being conducted by video. And it seems that this trend will only go in one direction. Just some key stats that have come out of this. Apparently 6% of the nation's households now do not have access to the internet, and 4.2 million adults have either never used the internet or have not accessed it in the last 3 months. So in a world where everything is going online, if you're not part of that, then you really are excluded from both opportunities, access to markets, access to jobs, access to information, and in some cases, access to health. So I'd just like to put this to the panel here. So, I mean, what is the digital exclusion and what is the impact? I thought, Hannah, could I start with you?
Yeah, absolutely. Thanks so much, Gareth, and thanks, digital leaders, for having us today. So I'm Hannah. I work on advocacy at Good Things Foundation. We are the UK's leading digital inclusion organisation. And yeah, we have found, so our journey has been really interesting in that actually the past 10 years, so since our founding, we were pioneering and really sort of leading the way when it came to digital skills support. So the backbone of our organisation was providing adults, so typically sort of vulnerable adults, those that are harder to reach, with digital skills support. However, 2020, the pandemic hit and the consequential lockdowns across this country. And we found that the accessibility piece was a massive chunk of digital inclusion. And it was a big chunk that we were missing. So we started up something called the National Data Bank, which provides free mobile connectivity data to the people that we support through the community organisations that work very closely with us. They make up our National Digital Inclusion Network. And we also launched something called the Device Bank, which hopefully later on I'll have more time to talk about. But we found the data aspect of this absolutely mind-blowing insofar as our demand for data, the hook when we start telling people and raising awareness of the issue of very simply imagine the world, your world without internet connectivity. And our data bank now, as of earlier this year, we've had 1,000 data banks. We made that mark across the country this year, and just on a regional level, we saw 100 data banks be marked earlier this year in the Greater Manchester region, which lends me very nicely to pass the mic over to Beena.
Thanks, Hannah. I suppose you've already touched upon kind of what digital exclusion inclusion means. I think, as you said, digital inclusion initiatives have been happening for decades. Since the internet began, there has been divides in terms of who can access as well as who cannot access. And certainly the pandemic, we've seen the acceleration of digital transformation with businesses and the workplace moving online, but also public services as well. So it really kind of brought to the fore what our digital ambitions, particularly in Greater Manchester, what it means in terms of our first priority, which is about empowering people. So that's the reason why we came together in partnership with our 10 local boroughs to make sure we can address this inequality and and understand it better. So we were seeing, you know, everything from schools and colleges that didn't have the young people couldn't connect with their education. We were seeing older people that couldn't connect and access healthcare, manage their healthcare either, job seekers that could continue looking for jobs, as well as everything from public services seeming to be inaccessible, as well as homeless shelters. Again, people that simply couldn't afford that connectivity were being disconnected from life. So it was a real focus for us, and also in terms of thinking about digital exclusion. So we were looking at, and I know Gareth, you quoted the kind of Ofcom figures, but we were also looking at reassessing what it means. So it's not just people with no digital engagement at all. It was people with low levels of digital engagement that couldn't access the internet confidently, or had the skills to be able to access the internet. What that looks like in Greater Manchester is 1.2 million, up to 1.2 million residents in Greater Manchester are digitally excluded. That's 41% of our population. So it really drove forward a need to focus on this from a regional basis.
And the two sort of points you've mentioned there, I think, before we do get into the real focus point of this session, which is looking at mobile connectivity, it's the obvious thing is to say, well, you have to have access, and you have to be able to have either a mobile or broadband connection. But there is a real part of this sort of debate where people have access to that, yet are still digitally excluded. And I think you touched on sort of particularly the elderly who sometimes they have confidence issues, or they don't trust the use of the internet. We've seen like huge sort of rise in fraud through the internet as well. And there are many, it's multifaceted. And I just think if we could just maybe jump into that again before we do get on the specific connected points. But actually, you know, people still struggle. And there's been studies by, for instance, for people who do have access to it are simply not going that way as well. I mean, Hannah, have you experienced that yourself?
Yeah, no, absolutely. And it is so fascinating. I think, so we worked with a woman called Kat Dixon last year who she was one of our data poverty lab fellows, and she created something called the pointless triangle. So it's a triangle, you got skills, you got devices, and you've got data, and you can't be digitally included if you don't have all three. And obviously today we're going to be talking about the data element, which I would argue kind of comes first. For example, if you have a device but it's not loaded with connectivity data, then it does become useless. And this pointless triangle kind of lays that out really neatly. However, in spite of Good Things Foundation, our services crossed all three pillars. There are real nuances in terms of why people aren't online, despite the fact they may have connectivity data, for example. So first and foremost, is the connectivity data good enough? Like, is it really slow? And is it high quality? And let alone like your motivation or your confidence. But if it's not very good, if you live in a rural area, for example, then yeah, you may well have it, but what's the point in using it? And second to that, I think that, yeah, the devices element, for example, the skills element particularly links to people's motivation, people's confidence. If they're able to still access their public services, if they're able to still get a doctor's appointment and they don't feel particularly safe online, then why would they be online? And I also think that there's other areas here which are so often overlooked just owing to the group of people of which it might impact. For example, if you experience disabilities, if, for example, you experience a visual impairment and it's much more likely you need a screen reader, but they're not particularly easy nor affordable to get your hands on, then again, like, it's all good and well having connectivity, but you can't get online. Beena, I wonder if you've got anything further to add on that.
Yeah, I think I mean, as you pointed out, Hannah, those things go hand in hand. We can't look at connectivity as a standalone. We've got to look at accessibility. We've got to look at devices that are fit for purpose, as well as the kind of skills, confidence, motivation piece. So in Greater Manchester, we see this as a need to look at digital skills, for example, as digital skills for work, life and business, because it impacts those different areas in different ways. But you can't think about it as an isolated, focus around connectivity. It has to go hand in hand with participation and also supporting people to use the internet safely and confidently. And Gareth, you mentioned the online scams challenge as well. That is one of the biggest fears for particular groups, older people, in terms of why they may want to go online, but also the relevance to them. So people might not think that, a WhatsApp video call is being online, but actually, it's been their main way to connect with families and friends during the pandemic and beyond. So it has to go hand in hand. We see digital inclusion and that whole spectrum. It's a spectrum of inclusion, it's a spectrum of exclusion. And in Greater Manchester, we've got 3 priority groups, which is young people, older people and disabled people, as well as targeting approaches for each of those areas, because what it means for young people is very different to what it means for older people and disabled people. But also there's a whole strand around the poverty element. So that in itself is a major focus for us in the region.
And you mentioned sort of confidence and motivation, I was struck actually, Hannah, you've just brought out a report yourselves at libraries, and I was really interested in reading that report, that what it's saying is these are safe spaces, they have positivism in there, they're open to all. A lot of them have free internet access now, and the suggestion was to use libraries much more in this debate. And would you like to just give us a précis of your report?
Yeah, absolutely. Well, I'd rather kind of talk more broadly about libraries, but also similar organizations which provide that more informal learning environment, as that is the heart of Good Things Foundation and our model. That's why it works. In that libraries are a massive facet of something called our National Digital Inclusion Network. And that network is made up of 2,000 odd community organisations across the UK. But as you very rightly said, Gareth, what these community organisations provide to the people who are, as I said earlier, sort of deemed typically harder to reach, kind of vulnerable citizens, that they provide a really open and warm and friendly environment, which isn't particularly intimidating and doesn't follow this very linear formal education pathway. And it's not to say that that should be dismissed, but it's more the fact that they tend to meet people where they are. And they, within our network now, are providing data, they are providing devices, they are supporting people with digital skills, and providing that motivation, or underpinning all of that is then the motivation, because you feel much more safe and able to be online, and the confidence kind of comes along with that as well.
Excellent. And I really, so at this point, I'd like to move on to the sort of the connectivity aspect, because obviously that is a key to this debate. And what, from my point of view, and as representing the mobile companies here, I really want to sort of emphasize and highlight the role of mobile in here, because it's often not necessarily considered on parity with fixed broadband, and sometimes it's not. I think mobile, when we talk to local authorities, it really isn't part of their agenda. Now we've launched today a report, I'm going to bring it up on screen here, from exclusion to inclusion, the role of mobile connectivity. Please do go onto Mobile UK's website and download it. But there's some really interesting stats, and this is sort of where I think we need to think more about this. Is, for instance, 21% of adults now only access their internet via a smartphone. And there are 1.5 million households that access the internet via only a mobile connection. So it's certainly an area which is becoming more and more important. If you look at young people are more likely only to access mobile. Equally, in some cases, it can be seen as a more affordable one. You can get your sort of monthly rates for a few pounds, up to 10 or more at the lower end. And actually, some people can see it now. Now, I must caveat that with, obviously, if you use heavy usage and heavy data, a broadband connection may be the better option. But certainly, mobile has become a very convenient and useful way to access the internet. But again, we need to get the policy space thinking about mobile. And certainly from our view as well, we've got to ensure that the investment environment is right so we can build those networks and build them right. But we still struggle with many barriers to that. Again, going back to a lot of people and their perceptions and understanding of how the infrastructure works, don't necessarily want the infrastructure near them, which means we can't build it and actually have that quality of signal and quality of coverage you've had. But just to highlight as well, there is huge investment going in. We mentioned rural, there's the shared rural network. which will extend mobile coverage to 95% of the population. That will be 4G coverage. And the government has announced now 5G standalone to the majority of populated areas by 2030. So there is a lot going on in this space. But as I say, from looking, when we looked into this, there is really a public policy void in some ways, and especially at the local authority level, of really understanding that mobile is a big part of this debate, and working with both the industry, with government, with local figures, and the third space as well, communities and charities as well, to make this part of that agenda. I'm just keen then to see your own thoughts on that area as well. Beena, I think let's go back to you first. And equally, I know you had we mentioned the numbers of the data bank, for instance, the 100th I think was in Manchester, and obviously looking at data particularly with a mobile focus.
Yeah, so I think just in terms of that connectivity piece, and I mentioned there's a whole poverty element here with people simply not being able to afford that connectivity to get online. And not just that, many connectivity packages are inaccessible for people, particularly people who have poor credit ratings, we've seen, as well as those that simply live in paycheck to paycheck. And we've seen that kind of exacerbated during, the cost of living crisis, but people living in poverty have been living in poverty for some time. It's not a new phenomenon as part of the cost of living crisis, but what we're seeing are there's people that hadn't really considered themselves as living in poverty are now living and struggling to get by with the increase in cost for food and fuel and all of those elements. Digital inclusion is a basic human right, and we consider that in Greater Manchester, but we also see connectivity as a basic utility, and we've mentioned kind of why this has been important for life and access to life and opportunities. But just back to that connectivity element, so 1 out of 5 residents in Greater Manchester live in social housing. So we set up a social housing pilot programme with 5 national telecoms industry to look at how do we connect up social housing, affordable social housing connectivity programs for up to 5,000 social housing residents in Greater Manchester. There were some really interesting findings, particularly when it comes to connectivity that is fit for purpose for people. And whilst there are things like social tariffs when it comes to broadband, we also understand that for many people, that's still inaccessible. So you've got people's ability to afford, as well as the telecoms industry ability to provide that affordable solution. So there's also a gap in the middle, and there's a role here for local authorities, for national government, as well as others to look at how do we address those gaps. Just in terms of the connectivity piece, we worked with a lot of the telecoms industry during the pandemic, and at that point we were looking at emergency solutions. So everything from the connective communities package with Vodafone, the schools connected package that they had provided beforehand. And again, this was emergency solutions, but we really need to focus on what is sustainable. What we found from the social housing pilot, for example, was that it was older residents that were more bought into those mobile connectivity solutions. So we have seen a kind of rise in terms of who's using what and what is relevant for them in their lives. But that was the Vodafone kind of, it was the biggest uplift for participation and access with Vodafone's tariffs in itself. So we've really seen what a model of best practice looks like, not just around having that connectivity, but also participation. That went hand in hand with local skills programs in the neighbourhoods, that kind of community-led places where people could go to get those skills. Just on the kind of connectivity element though, we're still seeing that even though there are affordable or social tariffs solutions out there, we launched our Greater Manchester Data Bank as part of the National Digital Inclusion Great Data Banks by the Good Things Foundation in June last year. Between June and March, we had 130 community organisations that have signed up as data banks. That includes all of our libraries across Greater Manchester. And you mentioned that earlier, Gareth, because we've got to rethink our roles. So libraries very much are one of those places where people go, whether it's, you know, in the winter, not being able to use their heating at home, so go into places where they can really spend some time without having to worry about staying warm. Now, out of that 130, between June and March this year, we had 200,000 residents that benefited from the data bank in Greater Manchester. So that tells you the depth of the challenge, that even though we've got solutions out there and we're working with industry nationally around what the solutions could be to support people, there is a vast amount of people that simply can't afford it. So that 20,000 residents access that free mobile connectivity tells you the depth of the challenge that we're facing.
And just to come back on the social tariffs point, which I think is a really fascinating and alive one at the moment, because having worked at it from this side as well, we found that social tariffs, where they are available, aren't always taken up. And there's, again, many reasons for them. Some are because of the stigma that it's a social tariff. Some people find they have to prove that they have universal credit or they're on certain benefits. And actually, I think it is worth raising sometimes that actually there are, especially within the mobile space, there are pay-as-you-go, or there's contracts available that are cheaper than a social tariff and don't necessarily have the same kind of conditions attached. Certainly also what is called a social tariff, in one essence, it may be called something else. And just to give an example, you know, we've got Virgin Media O2 provide their essential broadband and essential broadband plus streams. You have the EE Mobile Basics, and you have Voxy by Vodafone as well. And Three, again, known for some of the cheapest tariffs. So it's, I think, you know, we certainly in the UK are some of the cheapest tariffs available as compared to other countries. But there is that stigma involved sometimes in trying to push people down a certain way. And I think that has to be more open in terms of just trying to give things that say, you know, the word social tariff, when actually what's out there may actually be better available for some. Again, Hannah, you wanted your point.
Yeah, no, it's really interesting. I think we found social tariffs, as you rightly said, Gareth, there's not this sort of like broad stroke like formula. Typically, they support people who are accessing the social security system. For example, if you receive universal credit, then you're much more likely to be eligible. Likewise, pension credit, XYZ. However, the variation is in abundance, and we see most providers providing them, which is fantastic. And we've seen, I think, two main providers, so both Virgin Media and Vodafone, earlier this year announced a reduction in the contract price, which is also fantastic. So we're getting there. Awareness raising still needs to be a huge then just needs to be more of a push. Like, a lot of people don't know that they exist. And I think we also find that they can be quite arduous to apply for. So a lot of the people we support, despite the fact with the best intentions, go and, you know, think that £12 a month sounds much more affordable. And likewise, once you're within a social tariff, you're not going to experience, for example, mid-contract price hikes. That's in the T's and C's. You don't experience that. However, you know, they are quite clunky, and I think that we perceive like a bit of an overhaul just around the whole system. And the need for data is 100% there, as Beena said, like on that regional level. They're seeing it. On the national level, we've now distributed over 177,000 SIM cards for mobile, and these SIM cards provide mobile connectivity. And yeah, just kind of on the industry point, you know, these SIM cards have been donated to organizations like ours for free. So that's Vodafone, Virgin Media O2, and Three UK. And, you know, when we've, for example, Good Things Foundation, you know, some of our advocacy and policy work has been calling on central government to reduce the tax on broadband social tariffs from 20% down to 0%, and for that reduction to go straight in the end consumer's pocket. And, you know, Virgin Media O2, when we put it forward to them, were the first to sign the letter and say, yeah, we agree. So I think there is a role of government here, central government particularly, that we're not seeing as much as maybe we would like, knowing how integral mobile connectivity is in this modern world.
Certainly, and I would just stress that obviously you're speaking on behalf of the Good Things Foundation. I would suggest that's 3 mobile operators named there. I know EE have got their own initiatives as well in their own from their own point of view. And I think, you know, just the point about just giving device SIMs out, you know, certainly in the pandemic, something I experienced within the 4 mobile operators was that we provided SIMs to free of charge to many charities and schools and others. And actually, some of the things we found was that actually people didn't have the devices to use them, or they didn't know how to put them into a phone. And again, it was going back to those simple skills that for most of us seem to be something we do as second nature, but that's not the case, and that became very clear during the pandemic. And I thought, you know, while the industry very much moved quickly to work with the government and work with say charities and others to help, there were other issues that needed to be done, and that's where really there is a role, I think, for, as you say, for national government, but local governments as well. And then we mentioned libraries earlier. You know, people being able to go into libraries and actually get help with form filling, but actually how to use a device, how to use an iPad, how to put a SIM card in. Those kind of things are critically important. So I think that does sort of bring us in that, you know, to start looking at what is the government's role here, because you know, let's be honest, national digital inclusion strategy hasn't been updated since 2014, and you know, we need some leadership on this. You know, what is the action and strategy and direction we're taking? Beena, I think you're trying to jump in there.
I was just going to say, could I take a step back to the previous question, because there's a couple of points I wanted to make. We're talking about people that simply aren't digital connected or have low levels of skills in terms of using the internet confidently, and being able to access it in a safe way. There is a role here for libraries, yes. There's a role here for community groups, and I think the main thing around this is we can talk about all of the solutions there are in the world, but we've got to make it easy for people to navigate, because otherwise it can become overwhelming and people simply would not engage at all. There are many that will continue with their connectivity provider as loyal customers, but also not kind of look at price comparison sites because they simply don't have the ability to, or get online. And as we know, 52% of residents can spend £300 or more on utilities because they simply can't access price comparison sites and things like that. So we have a role here locally. So with us, for example, in Greater Manchester, we have 10 boroughs. So we've got digital inclusion leads in each borough to make sure that they can coordinate their local borough's ecosystem, from community groups to the health sector to businesses, to make sure that we're coming together to drive those particular gaps, and make it easy for residents to be able to access and signpost to the various options available to them. We are working with digital champions, or to train library staff as digital champions, because many of the staff, as we have heard, simply aren't able to support people that have come to them. The other part around digital skills is, talking to some of the teachers that we've seen, and we provided a Greater Manchester Tech Fund to support young people through education, as well as targeting support in our second phase around pupil referral units and special educational needs schools. We heard that there were laptops still locked in cupboards because the teachers did not have the skills to be able to download software appropriately or safely. So again, there is a role here for local authorities in terms of coordination, but also from a regional level. How can we work with tech organisations and others to address those particular gaps, which is what we are doing. So yes, there is a role for government, there's a role nationally, but there's also a role locally, and there's a role with communities as well. So our focus is really about being community-led and working in partnership with our local boroughs. And there's a role here to convene and join the dots, which is the most important thing if we are to make sure that the impact is greater than the sum of our parts.
And that's sort of, I love that. I love what you're saying, because I think, you know, this from building awareness and understanding and confidence needs to happen also at a very young level. And we've sort of talked about libraries, but there's a role here for schools as well to build that. And I recently saw on the pressing, I think it's Cadoxton School, which is a primary school, had this 5G immersive space, and they started doing augmented reality learning, virtual reality, and that's really getting these kids involved in this technology to be confident with it. So when they do leave, you know, they are already there, and you're not become that sort of have not before you've even started. And I do think, and there is a role for education in this piece, and again, just to, you know, Mobile UK, we have a lot of sort of awareness raising information, explaining how 5G works, what it is, what the infrastructure is, and why it works. Because again, you know, getting it into those places, you know, also means that people have to be comfortable with it. And you know, as we move into a society where, you know, the Internet of Things is coming about, it's no longer the mobile phone. The mobile phone is very much what we think of as mobile connectivity, but mobile connectivity is going to be far more than that. You know, it's going to be your fridge talking to your smart meter, your traffic lights talking to ambulances to let people go through. Yeah, the world of data is only going to grow exponentially as it is. I think it's already growing, as Ofcom says, by 40% every year. So, you know, it's incumbent on us to build those networks, but it's incumbent on people to be comfortable with those networks as well. And I think, you know, that's sort of bringing it back. You know, we've talked about libraries, there's schools as well. Equally, I think, you know, the local level, we need to see councils saying they want to be mobile connected, they want to be 5G ready. And that is something we don't necessarily see. And you know, if we haven't got councils being very positive about this, you tend to then get sort of, again, when it comes back to that sort of infrastructure builder, well, the people aren't comfortable. They want it somewhere else, you know, not understanding that actually having that piece of infrastructure close by means you have a good, strong signal, you'll have good capacity, and you're more likely to be able to access, you know, everything that we've been talking about. And I think that's, I don't know what your sort of view on how local authorities is, but, you know, I certainly, Manchester is very much, you know, very well resourced, larger, Greater Manchester, sorry, combined authority. There are a lot of local authorities out there that just don't have necessarily the capacity or the resources to do this. And just to bring on a recent government announcement of the £14 million regional innovation zones, I mean, I have a very real concern that actually it's only those councils that have the resources to bid for that money that are going to get that money. So where do we then leave the councils that don't? Open up.
Yeah. Beena, do you want to come in first?
Yeah, I suppose I've got to challenge kind of that point around local authorities not necessarily seeing mobile as part of the digital inclusion strategy. I recently spoke at another event and I asked, who has a digital strategy, who has the digital inclusion strategy? And this was a major digital event with tech leaders in it. Probably a handful of people or less put their hand up. And I suppose the question is, who has a digital strategy? You know, and where does digital inclusion come into that? We also, as we said, work in partnership with our 10 local boroughs, but we recognise that the ability to address digital inclusion for each borough is different. And I've been speaking to combined authorities and local authorities across the UK. This is part of a journey. It's for a journey for many. So how can we come together to share resources, to share learnings, and look at actually what is the framework that we need to put in place locally to make sure we can address digital inclusion? What are the opportunities around connectivity? And it's not just broadband and mobile, it's what are the innovative ways that we can address that connectivity. For people that simply don't want to have the internet at home, there's libraries and free public Wi-Fi in other places, but again, it has to go hand in hand with connecting safely. We've also seen local banks and telecoms companies who are opening up their doors to be digital champions for people, not necessarily their own customers. So everyone's really reconsidering their role. And as local authorities, they are then seeing what is the art of the possible in terms of addressing this. And again, they don't have all the answers. We don't have all the answers. But what we've seen is by coming together as industry, community groups and public sector, how can we address some of those gaps together? Hannah,
Hannah, do you have anything to add?
Yeah, no, I do. So I also would challenge the idea that local authority isn't, quite doing enough, because I think that there are two things at play here. I think first and foremost, that's, not the experience that we have at Good Things Foundation. Don't get me wrong, it's not uniform. But we do work closely with local authorities across the country, and combined authorities as well, of which hold several locals within a wider group. For example, we've just finished, or rather, we've just released our reports where we were funded by the UK Community Renewal Fund. And we worked in 3 different combined authority areas: North of Tyne, West Midlands, and Greater Manchester. And within those combined authorities, the local authority sat, and we provided people with, mobile connectivity data, devices, and provide them with digital skills. And we created a pathway in these different areas where they were supported and engaged by community organisations and adult learning providers. And then these organisations worked in partnership with further education colleges for people to progress into further learning, or for people to go on to employment. And it was really successful. You can check out the Good Things Foundation website for the report, which was put on there last week. Very exciting. But that's a really good example of what we're seeing on that regional and local level. And I would say also added to that is just circling back to what we were saying about 2014. That's when we saw a digital inclusion strategy. That's the last time I saw digital inclusion come out of central government. And similarly, there's a lot of people that we work with within government who, are really kind of like trying to fly the flag and like really trying to push the needle on this issue. But actions speak louder than words, and like funding speaks louder. And we're not seeing a lot of investment into this issue. And I think if we were to, then I would not be surprised to see that central government funding leak into that local and regional level, local authorities, combined authorities, and then that, also filter through to that community, like really hyper-local level that we see in our National Digital Inclusion Network. And then I think the score would be very, very different. But we had to see that, yeah.
Well, I did, from my point of view, it's certainly something we want to see, and while I certainly wouldn't suggest that local authorities are doing nothing, and certainly there is, as you said, I think the word varied is very important there. There are some with more resources than other, and some others. We've been campaigning as an organisation, Mobile UK, for digital champions. We want to see funded digital champions, central government funding digital champions, to have people who are skilled and understand both the technology, have the ability to collaborate across the wider local authority space, bringing together things like the social care department, the economic department, the strategy department, the estates department, the planning department, to really embed mobile within all of those, and also to have the ability to engage with us as the industry as well, and give us a single point of contact. Because if it's not really well understood across 1 or 2 departments, then there are other departments missing. And what we find is it's almost, mobile can be siloed sometimes into the planning department, because that's where you interface with the infrastructure side of things, or a local authority may have a focus on broadband because that's where necessarily the public subsidy is going. So things like Project Gigabit or local full fibre network, and that's where those resources are focused. Now, there's no problem with that, but I just think what we need is this more sort of holistic approach to what mobile can do, and certainly how it impacts on this debate. And I think once we start to get that, then it seeps through. Just mentioning that social care aspect, the opportunities that are available for mobile in terms of patient care, enabling people to work more remotely, spending more time with patients, their data, their patient notes being secure and kept in the cloud and being able to be used wherever they are. All of these things really help. But equally, social care is the biggest principal budgetary constraint of mobile, of local authorities at the moment. And there's huge opportunities for efficiencies there using this technology. But it's not, social care is not really thought of in the prism of mobile. It's seen as digital, so we'll leave it into that silo.
Yeah.
That's where it needs to be brought together, and that's certainly why we feel so strongly about digital champions. But that variable point, some places, Beena, this is your role, this is fantastic, but in another local authority, it might be someone's role which is 10% of their time, which for a huge issue like this, they just don't have the capacity to necessarily spend what it needs to have that role. I don't know if you have a comment on that.
I mean, as I said, Gareth, that for all local authorities across the UK, for all combined authorities. This is a journey. So many of them, you know, we kind of focused around this agenda and built this agenda because of what we saw was happening during the pandemic. As I said, digital inclusion initiatives have been happening for decades, but there wasn't really a joint approach in terms of joining this up. Certainly in Greater Manchester, we were seeing a lot of success with hyperlocal initiatives such as Starting Point, which were basically a coffee shop that people were going to be able to get online or simply wanting to access their bank accounts. So there was a need to focus around this, because without an explicit focus, things were being left within gaps. They would fall within gaps of digital transformation teams or IT teams, and not really kind of bring in the social element of this. We see digital exclusion as a facet of social exclusion and border inequality. So we really had to approach this on that level. As I said, this is a journey for many local authorities, and we're still seeing with our 10 boroughs, there are some more advanced than others in terms of their focus. So really, by bringing people together, it's a catalyst for them to understand, well, what is out there that can help enhance their digital inclusion work locally, but also how can they share resources to make sure that is a catalyst for them being able to bring that to their residents, bring that to the senior leadership. But many of them have got other fingers in many other pies. You know, it's just part of their job. And I think looking at the local council's restraints, particularly when it comes to other priorities, that is also always going to be the case. But I think it also brings benefits with that. So somebody who sits in the adult education team, someone who sits within the libraries team that is thinking about digital inclusion, this is a key part to bring to their wider work. So I do think we all bring a depth of knowledge from our various areas. But again, this is a journey. We've been having different conversations now than we had 5 years ago. So it just kind of shows how ourselves as local and regional government has been able to make sure that this digital inclusion is central to our agenda. We mentioned the strategy, the national strategy. Now that was of its time, and I think there is a focus here now to bring together a digital inclusion strategy as part of the national digital strategy, which again was launched without having a digital inclusion element of it, because we have to make sure that our digital ambitions are of this time and reflects those standards that we need to address on a local level. So many of those 10 local authorities have now got a digital inclusion strategy with leadership around it, and that has been because of the focus that each of the leaders, each of the digital inclusion leads have to make sure it is part of their local strategy.
You know, I think that's very succinctly, but we've got a minute left, and I need an outro to sort of to finish it off. But Hannah, I wanted to give you one last chance to sort of put your last word. We certainly do seem to be coalescing on the need for this for an update of the digital inclusion strategy. But Hannah, you've got 30 seconds.
No, absolutely. Thanks so much, Elevator. I just want to give a nod to sort of what Beena was saying around this sort of like ecosystem and making everything join up. And we see that so successfully sort of executed in the Greater Manchester Combined Authority area. And I think that there is something that central government can maybe learn from that, drawing on what you were saying, Gareth. We're actually asking for government to obviously invest in digital inclusion. Of course we are. But we want to see it across different government departments. And we've done our costings so that we're asking 5 different government departments to invest in digital inclusion. And then that puts a nice bow on the fact that if you're DLUC or if you're DWP or, you know, XYZ, that you're investing in digital inclusion because you know that it matters to your initiative. And I think that there's something very important here from what we're talking about in terms of it does underpin everything.
Brilliant.
So, yeah.
Well, Beena and Hannah, first I'd like to thank both of you. I'd like to thank Digital Leaders Week. I think it's been a fascinating discussion. Certainly, I think this could go on for a lot longer. I would like to remind those that are listening in today of both Hannah's report as well and the work Beena's doing. Please go to their websites, the Greater Manchester Combined Authority and Good Things Foundation. Equally, we have our own report, as I said today, from exclusion to inclusion, the role of mobile. That is up on our website now. Please go down to the Mobile UK's website and read that. We'll be putting a Live Better Connected campaign, which we're looking to launch soon. That is about building awareness around mobile and understanding about mobile. Again, I'd encourage people to follow that. You can find more about that on our Twitter page at mobileuk_news, on our LinkedIn and our website. I would like to thank everyone for listening in. It's been a fantastic session. So thank you all, and thank you, Beena, and thank you, Hannah.
Thanks so much.
Thanks, everyone. Thanks,
Thanks
Gareth.
for having us. Thanks, Gareth. Bye-bye.
Bye all.